Joe says it's not there. You can create a book.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the afternoon session of the Frontline Network Annual Conference. My name is Sandra Brown, an Associate Diversity Consultant with Diverse Minds. I've been a diversity consultant for over 12 years, working in both public and private organisations with a particular focus on disability, gender, and race. Today, I'm going to spend some time with you identifying and overcoming unconscious bias in our work practice. So to help create a safe space for us to engage in this subject, I'd like to refer to these rules of engagement. First one is acknowledgement that whilst potentially at different stages, we are all on a journey and some aspects may cause discomfort. Bring your own experience to the discussion by using the chat function. Be open to the ideas that may be generated. And feel free to ask questions using the Q&A function, and these will be picked up at the end. So, if we're happy, let's proceed. So in today's session, we're going to be defining and exploring what we mean by unconscious bias, the psychology behind our thinking, behaviours, stereotypes and attitudes, how we can recognise, address unconscious bias in ourselves, colleagues and organisations, how staff and organisations can overcome this and adapt, and then looking at some tools and strategies to manage unconscious bias and take action going forward. So although we've just met, I'd really like to cook you a meal for when we are all back in the office at some point. So the menu that I'd like to put on for you begins with lobster bisque with crab pate and wholemeal crostini, followed by venison steak with red wine sauce served with mashed potato with butter and chives, fresh petit pois and steamed broccoli. And that's all going to be washed down with rich almond and cherry tart, served with caramelized hazelnuts, peanuts, almonds, with a side of clotted cream. Wow, what a menu. Having seen that menu, I'm going to put up a poll now, say, who do you think can eat everything on this menu? Can you eat everything on this menu? Who couldn't eat everything on this menu? Right, so, yeah. yeah, roughly, that's what I thought, 73% of us not able to eat everything on this menu. So as we can see from the poll, we've got 73% not able to share everything on this menu, and 27% yes, saying yes, that they'll be able to eat. So as we can see from that poll, that we had 73% there who had no, that there were some delegates who just wouldn't be able to eat anything on, wouldn't be able to eat some, would be able to eat something on the menu. But as you can see, I'm not able to change my menu because I've ordered the best lobster from Canada and the best venison from the estate in the UK. You know, I went to a lot of trouble to go and get these particular items for the menu. But then having talked to people who might have been at my dinner party, the responses are likely to be that they were upset, they're hurt, annoyed, probably feel let down, even though they've just been invited to a free meal, hungry, because there's absolutely nothing there that they could possibly eat, or even marginalized. So we can see that often inclusion can be missed when we really mean to do well. And it's up to us to consider dietary requirements, allergies, religious and cultural food requirements as a host. It's vital to ask the right questions. We may not have all the answers, but we can discover where those answers may be. So some of the challenges we might face are, what we may perceive as being the best will not always suit everyone. It goes beyond the concept of political correctness. It's okay to not have all the answers. And it's also okay to ask for help, advice, direction, and feedback, even though we might have a wealth of experience. Right, I'm going to show you a series of images for about 20 seconds each. I'd like you to jot down the first things that come into your head when you see the images. First image coming up. Second image. And the final image. Okay, so what I'd like to ask you is to let me know what you feel. You can write in the chat. What is an observation? Just type that in the chat for me. Okay. So if we look and we see that what's an observation? Right, so you can see that we've got one response, that a perception. Of a situation, feature of the environment we've been made thinking, writing, talking. Thank you. Okay. And then as you can see, a perception of what you're looking at. Yeah. Great, thanks for those. But here you can see on the slide, observation is the active acquisition of information from a primary source. In living beings, observation employs the senses. In science, observation can also involve the recording of data via the use of instruments, and a statement based on something one has seen, heard, or noticed. For example, X made the observation that the mercury rose by 5 degrees. So having thought about the word observation, let's now move to what is an assumption in this context? And not religious context, but what is in this context of having seen the pictures that were put up in front of you? Drop me something in the chat. Okay, something you assume to be the case. Coming to a conclusion, not always accurate, based on some information you have. And from Justine, forming an opinion that is not based on fact. Okay, thank you for those. So an assumption in this context is for saying that something that is accepted as true or as certain to happen without proof. For example, they've made certain assumptions that the market was going to crash with no basis. Or the most transmissible COVID-19 variants are coming from outside the UK. It might be fact, it might be an assumption. But these are things that have happened. So what did you say about the things you wrote down about the pictures? Anybody want to share in the chat? Were there any assumptions made about any of the pictures? About the family? Or the person taking photos? Let's have a look. Right, yep, a happy family. Assume the family was happy. Yep, happy seems to be a thing for the first picture. Ah, person taking the photos remind me of travel. Hopefully we'll be able to do that soon. Happy family. Yeah. We're all feeling that at the moment. And what do you feel was the balance between assumptions and observations? I think we've seen from the chat that a lot of it was we assumed. We had a more an assumption than an observation. There were things that we immediately jumped to. So we can see that some things we see in the news, i.e. the most transmissible variants are coming from outside the UK. This may be true, but lots of assumptions are made. In some training that I do, I normally have a picture of a black man who has dreadlocks and he's smoking. And I say to the audience, I say, well, just give me your first opinions, your observations of this person. And invariably, he's somebody from South London, one of the areas in South London. The fact that he has locks is he must be from Jamaica. And if he's smoking, there's only one thing he could be smoking, some sort of drug. Again, assumptions. Because what we know is that this person may have locks to give a fashion statement. He may just be smoking an ordinary cigarette. And we don't know unless we ask the person where they're from. We're making assumptions, of course, this is really natural. And we receive a huge amount of information and have to make sense of it. And our lived experiences are going to shape how we view things. There is a perception in society of homeless people that has been created by a collection of myths and assumptions, some of which are wrong. These can be dangerous and interfere with attempts to help those in need. I love this quote by Annie Nin. We see the world as we are, not as it is. Just take a minute to pause and take that in. We see the world as we are, not as it is. None of us can be 100% neutral because we all have our own lens in which we see things. So it's interesting just to have that to reflect on at times. So the way in which we make sense of the world and other people and our feelings, beliefs and behaviours are unique to each and every one of us. We all see things slightly differently, and so we treat ourselves and other people in various ways, depending on the situation. This, of course, is influenced by a number of factors. Our core values are shaped by our upbringing, family, friends. And as you can see in this model of our window on the world, with us, with our core values at the center, and then emanating from that, we can see aspects of identity. We all have different aspects of our identity. We form different relationships on various levels. And we all have been involved in a career, a job, or have a role to play. But how we identify ourselves in terms of protected characteristics and whether we have experience of homelessness or have inadequate or adequate housing. And that all goes towards making us our difference and the different challenges that we face in having those differences. And all the different aspects and types of relationships that we have will impact us all, whether it's through our career, our work, or our job role. And this interaction helps us develop our lens and our thoughts and our actions when we meet others. So, what is unconscious bias? Anyone want to hazard a guess? Yeah. Yep, I guess it's based on stereotype assumptions about people, groups that we have without realizing. Yep, projecting your own values lens onto how you interpret things without being aware of doing so. True, Kathy, thank you. Carrie, stereotypes we have about people, things that we are not conscious of. Great, thank you for that. So let's look at unconscious. So what we say we have, I mean, you've heard the saying, we all have prejudice towards something. It's an unsettling thought. However, psychologists have stated that prejudice is something we have in all of us. So unconscious bias refers to a bias that we are unaware of and which happens outside of our control. It is a bias that happens automatically and is triggered by our brain making quick judgments and assessments of people and situations, influenced by our background, cultural environment, and personal experiences. Unconscious bias can happen in everyday situations, regardless of where we are. We don't just make unconscious bias when something or someone is right in front of us. We can commit to it by hearing about something or someone over the radio, or watching it on television or on social media. We assume someone is naturally incompetent at something just because we don't know where they're from or the area they grew up in. As professionals, we need to be constantly aware of potential biases so we are not prejudiced towards someone because of their difference. Unconscious bias can manifest in many ways and in countless situations, so it is up to us to identify it so we realize we're biased towards someone or something. Thank you, Jo. So there you've got the interpretation there of unconscious bias. So what is unconscious bias? It can also be referred to as implicit, hidden, or associated bias. Implicit people preferences formed by our socialization. So we feel comfortable, we feel warm when we're with people who are like us. Since unconscious bias is a learned stereotype that stems from your experiences and background, it can take some time for us to challenge it. We need to be able to identify it and combat it so that we are able to give everyone the opportunity they deserve. I'd like to take you back some years now, when we first was introduced to Susan Boyle on Britain's Got Talent. Just imagine yourself in that audience. We were told that she would be singing. And immediately you could see the default boxes in all the heads of the audiences, as they had already decided that she wasn't going to go any further because they couldn't see that she'd be able to sing and get the judge's attention. But then you notice their faces when they were wrong, and she opened her mouth and sang like an angel. Again, those of you who might be cyclists, Chris Boardman from UK Cycling was talking about the motor industry coming in and advising him. The first question Lotus Elite asked was, why are the handlebars of the bike a particular length? He couldn't answer and felt stunned why he had never asked himself this before. It's often only when someone shines a light on this or on any issues that we can see things differently. Implicit people preferences the name of a good friend or family member makes us feel positively about someone. Equally, the converse is true. If someone has made our life difficult or problematic, we may have a negative perception of someone with this name. Past experience stays with us, positive or negative. Exposure to other views, newspaper images, and mismatching headlines, social media, or quick skimming and working in homelessness will be very familiar to you. But who is likely to be homeless and who isn't? Rhetoric about substance misuse and who deserves help and who doesn't. So we can see that with past experiences also influence our thinking. If we've been engaged with somebody who's different to us, we sort of judge that group by our interactions with that particular person in some instances. And then exposure to other people's views about groups of people, whether that be family or cultural, can also affect how we feel and how we interact and respond to people of difference. In Daniel Kahneman's book, Systems Thinking, Thinking Fast and Slow, he talks about there are two ways in which our minds work, our brain works. At the base of our skull, we have what we call the amygdala. I never pronounce that. And that little thing at the base of our skull indicates whether we are in flight or flight, depending on the situation we find ourselves. In his book, Kahneman describes System 1 and System 2. System 1 being often unconscious, implicit, requires little effort, and happens fast. We make things on the spot. Someone asks a question, the answer's there. For instance, if you're walking down the corridors, as we used to do in the office, and you're asked to give, and someone says to you, I really need, Sandra, I really need to know who's going to be taking part in this project. I need an answer now. And they want you to give the name of a person. And you immediately come to the mind and you say, right, Ahmed's the person for that job. You haven't thought about anybody else, but you've thought about, you know that you've worked with Ahmed before and he'd be good at a project. And if we move to System 2, and what Kahneman says is that this is where we make conscious and explicit decisions. More effort is required and also motivation to think about what we're doing. And this takes more time. So if we apply the same situation, if I'm walking down the corridor and someone stops me asking me for the name of a person to take on a project, what I'd say is, I'm sorry, can't make a decision now. I'll let you know tomorrow. Because there may be other people that I can consider, and giving it more thought and requiring more effort to consider who is available to do that project. Also, there are examples of sort of reading expressions and how that can make people feel easy. So if I said to you and gave you an equation of 23 times 44, some might be able to work it out immediately. Others may reach for their calculator, or others will just be sitting there and not know where to start. So you can imagine how that feels, how you get that anxiety, that rush. That's where the amygdala is working, flight or fancy, will I survive, be able to do this? Also, we can't really trust our memories. We don't always remember things in a straightforward way. Instead, remember our feelings more than the actual event as a whole. By understanding how our mind works, we can adjust our focus and dramatically change our thoughts and behaviors. There is a caveat here though, and that is for neurotypical people. If anyone identifies as being on the high functioning autism spectrum, they are likely to find the equation much easier than reading a facial expression. So it's important to note this, and that this isn't a catch-all model. So how does unconscious bias occur? So we are hardwired to prefer people who look like us, sound like us, and share our interests. It's comfortable, it's easier. Don't have to be too much thought in that. Social psychologists call this social categorization, where we routinely sort people into groups. In the same way, if I was to show you a cup, you would say, right, that's a cup, it's cylindrical, it's got a handle. I put that in a compartment in my brain that says cups, irrespective of what it looks like, but it has those key features. But there's this preference about sorting and bypassing our normal, rational, and logical thinking, where we think we know things, but it's just easier and quicker to just associate that thing or that person with that particular group. And these are effective processes, but the categories we use to sort people are not logical or rational. So further looking how unconscious bias occurs, let's go through a sort of life experience. So we learn as children that dark clouds are highly likely to signify rain. We also learn to associate snow with low temperatures. The repeated exposure to this correlation means that over time, an implicit cognitive association is formed between these two concepts. So what fires together, wires together. If we do not properly address these biases, they can negatively impact an organization's workplace, culture, and team dynamics. Although these biases can be pervasive, we can reduce their impact with deliberate attention and effort. Prejudice may be hardwired into us as part of our survival instinct, but we need to be the bigger person and not let it cloud or run our judgment. We don't like it when someone judges us just because of how we look or because we have an unfamiliar name. So we also need to stop doing the same to others. Now, if you were to Google unconscious bias, you'd find that there are over 150 different types of biases. Well, I've chosen 4 that we're going to talk about today, which occurs in any organization that I've been into, and also relatively behaviors that are displayed by most people. So the first one is affinity bias. Again, this is where we tune into the positive attributes of someone we like, ignoring the negative traits, in addition to focusing on the faults of those we don't like. So if we've got 2 members of staff in our teams, one of them comes in late all the time, but they're a great worker. And so we overlook the fact they're coming in late. But then we have a number of members of staff who comes in on time or has the odd occasion where they come in late, and we pick up on that. We're more drawn to the person and the positive attributes of the person. Under confirmatory bias, where we seek facts that confirm an existing perception or preconception, this could be positive or negative. So if you're looking at confirmatory bias, particularly if you're looking at how you can impact this and combat this, when you're looking and conducting research, make sure that you gather information from a wide variety of sources to get a balanced perspective. So you're not just taking it from one particular source. You've searched around so you get a really varied balance. So example, a social media platform where you follow people you agree with, but as soon as they raise a question or have an answer that you don't agree with, you unfollow them the moment they say something you don't agree with. And over time, this creates a filter bubble where you are only exposed to information that confirms your opinions. And then we have the halo effect, where an overall impression of a person impacts evaluation of that person's specific traits. So, i.e., they are attractive and therefore they're smart and kind, or they are tall with presence, so ideal for leadership. With the halo, one way to reduce the impact, particularly if we're looking from a recruitment perspective or where we're forming a new team, is to diversify the team that's looking for this new member of staff. Getting someone from another team to interview the candidate would help, as they have less reason to halo that person, as they will not be working directly with them. So they'll be able to give a more objective view. On perception bias, the tendency to form stereotypes and assumptions about certain groups that makes it increasingly difficult to take an objective view about individual members of these groups. So, if we heard the statement, they are all criminals, that creates an unreasonable fear of homeless people, prevents many who would help not doing so. It prevents people getting hired or renting a place to live. These assumptions can also make things difficult for charitable organisations to expand facilities due to objections from residents who are fearful for their safety. Challenge your assumptions. Ask yourself, how well do I really know that person or the group they belong to? Don't let preconceived notions prevent you from meeting and discussing with people. Think about the accuracy of statements. When you find yourself using strong words such as all or always and never to describe a certain group, pause and take a moment to ask yourself, how accurate is that description? If anyone has seen any of these biases in action, halo, perception, affinity, affirmity, and confirmatory, put examples in the chat where you've seen this occurring. It'd be interesting to hear some of your views on that. Right. Also in unconscious bias, we have explicit bias or implicit bias. Explicit bias is where this is expressed directly. The person is aware of the bias. It operates consciously. So for example, that person who is unkempt and scruffy must be homeless. On the flip side, you have implicit bias. And that's a word that I tend to substitute for unconscious bias because it's expressed indirectly. There's an unawareness of the bias. It operates subconsciously. For example, having cultural perceptions about who is far more likely to be homeless. So the fact that someone from a particular group may turn up in an office, one of the offices, well dressed, does not mean that that the decision is taken or an assumption is made about the group that they're from. So if it's somebody from South Asia, or someone from the African subcontinent. But they're well-dressed does not mean that they're unlikely or less deserving of your help or your assistance. And another example of implicit bias is asking a female friend if she has a boyfriend. By making that statement, we're assuming their sexuality and that heterosexuality is the norm or the default. What you could have said was ask your friend, is she seeing someone? Research has shown that implicit biases can be reduced through the very process of discussing them and recognizing them for what they are. Once we recognize, they can then be reduced or managed, i.e. through positive contact with members of that group. I just thought I'd add this slide in just to get some feedback from you through the chat, because I'm never quite sure whether it is a help or a hindrance. I can see that in some instances it can be a help. It can help as a platform for calling people out, but also equally it can give people a platform for talking about information and making assumptions about subjects and issues they have very little knowledge of. And from a youth perspective, yeah, I can see that having social media is a good way of reaching out to homeless youth regarding access to services. What do you think? Is it a help or a hindrance? Pop your views in the chat. Okay. So I'm going to introduce this word called a schema. If anybody's heard of it or have a different meaning, I'm going to pop up a meaning of what that is. So a schema is a mental concept that informs a person about what to expect from a variety of experiences and situations. Schemas are developed based on information provided by life experiences and are then stored in our memory. So this may be familiar to those with a psychology background, but this is a mental concept about what to expect from a variety of situations. And we also have schemas about ourselves. We have schemas, particularly when I worked in the education sector, about what's a professor? Who does a professor look like? And if you were to Google professor, you'd find that invariably it would be a white man with glasses, smoking a pipe, and with a quilted jacket. Schema, that's what people would expect to see from a professor. But we now know that that's not the case. So another example I'd like to share with you is how we go to the GP in the UK. We know we must call the surgery to book an appointment. We go to the surgery 10 minutes early, or we used to. We report to the reception. We wait in the waiting area. Our name is called, or it comes up on the digital screen. And we go and we get our 10 minutes with the doctor. This is useful, and we know what we need to do and how the system works. If we were then to move to another country or become unwell on holiday, it may be different, and this would throw us, because due to our expectations, we would not be having the same system or setup that we would expect and what we know. Here are some examples of schemas with some data. Fortunately, there's lots of examples within the corporate area, but very little with charities. But I just thought I'd put these up to give you an example of what schemas are and how they are shown. So as we can see, in the USA, CEOs of major corporates, 58% were over 6 foot, despite only 15% of the male population being at least that tall. Being white is a perceived attribute of the business leader archetype in the UK and USA. A woman of average weight in the US earns $389,300 less across her career than a woman who is 25 pounds below the average and who earns up to 25% more. So you can see that schemas play out and really impact the working and the service world. This term used in all our walks of life, from policy making to on the ground, but really what we are talking about are groups who are unable to access services. If we were to reflect on where we may have used this or other similar terms, it could be referencing our behaviour in relation to these groups. Term hard to reach groups. Where have we heard that before? Hard to reach refers to underrepresented groups who could be accessing services, but whose voices often go unheard and therefore their needs are left unmet. This could include LGBTQIA+ groups, global majority or BAME groups, disabled communities, and English as an additional language, or anyone substance misusing. The groups can go on. It was interesting, I was attending a training session with a group of academics where we were talking about closing the awarding gap between Black and white students. And when I mentioned about having to engage with the hard to reach groups of students, one academic came back to me and said, but is it really hard to reach, or is it that we class them as easy to ignore? And I thought that was quite apt, because if you think about easy to ignore, it's easier if you don't know about something to not to explore it and go with what you know. And so I think, yeah, I think I'd rather the easy to ignore rather than hard to reach groups. But like I said, are they really hard to reach? Or is it just our biases preventing us from engaging with these communities? What's your view about that term hard to reach groups? And how does that play out in your particular area of work? Drop it in the chat. Let's hear from you. Then we're going to look at that term reaching versus engagement, because the biases can prevent us from doing one or other of those two words. My definition that I'd like to put forward for engagement is how we generate our interaction with these underrepresented groups. And then looking at reach, who are we identifying for this engagement? Again, dropping a line in the chat, what would you say was the difference between engagement and reach? Be interested to hear your thoughts on that. And then the difference between that is that there may not be trust for a variety of reasons as to why people aren't coming forward or not engaging. Again, this hard to reach or easy to ignore group puts onus on the service user. You know, you're not accessing, you're not reading English, you're not seeing yourself as a substance user, you are da 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 da. Barriers faced to access services are often outside of their control. And it can be more useful to consider that services are hard to reach for systemic reasons, such as referral pathways and the ideal service user, and who is the ideal service user. And a good question that's been raised is, how can we support staff to feel safe to call out when they are seeing unconscious bias? Against people they support and who are accessing their services? Good question, Amanda. And we'll have some strategies towards the end. And Kathy is, to me, it echoes the idea of aiming for equality of outcome rather than equality of process. Simply put, recognizing one size does not fit all. That's a great example, great definition of the two, between the two. I like that one. In addition to Amanda's earlier question, what can we do to support individuals accessing services to feel safe when they might have experienced bias previously? Thank you. Right. I'll pick that one up a bit later, if that's okay, Amanda, when we get to that point. So also, some of our responses can be as a result from trauma. And also it can raise trauma amongst the way that we respond to some of our service users. So there's trauma awareness, where service providers incorporate an understanding of trauma into their work, recognizing that people from different cultures experience trauma differently. There's an emphasis on safety, service work to establish physical and emotional safety for clients. Whenever we have a traumatic event or a traumatic situation, it also has a lot of triggering. It brings up different aspects, different instances that have happened in our lives that can be either uncomfortable and can also be worrying. Or opportunities to rebuild control, increasing client choice and providing predictable environments. And then the strength-based approach, supporting people to identify their strengths and coping mechanisms. So people from diverse cultures have their own understanding of trauma, and that all suffering is not equal, but it's about how the individual experiences it. A tool that can be used to press that pause button and think about our behaviours and interactions with service providers is reflective practice. Reflective practice describes an individual or a team taking time to think about their role, including what is going well, what is difficult, how they are feeling, and how they make others feel. Reflective practice can be used by individuals or between colleagues, either one-to-one or as a group session. For example, after an incident, the team might be asked to reflect on what their role was in a given situation, how they felt, how their actions or words had an impact on the people around them, and what else was going on for the people involved, and how alternative approaches might achieve different outcomes in the future. This is in contrast to a more traditional approach to an incident or debrief, where the focus is on establishing what happened and deciding what to do as a result. For example, which rules were broken and which sanction to issue. And I think this goes to some way to answering the question that was raised by Amanda about what to do where you have people within your own team who are exhibiting their unconscious behavior is seeping out, and what to do. And this reflective practice provides you with a space to actually raise those questions in a safe environment and have that discussion about some things that were heard, some things that were said that were behaviorally inappropriate, but raising them so that everybody can understand and experience the information that's given the correct way and the quick response to things. Right, so now we're going to have another poll about how could your biases impact a trauma-informed response? And there are a number of options on there, so I'll give you a few minutes to have a read of those, and let's see what your feelings are in your answers. Yep. Yes, we can see that there are a couple there that are coming up as favorites. Right, let's see, we've got the majority of us have voted. So as we can see from the votes, offering a one-size-fits-all is in the lead. This is where we feel that a lot of biases impact a trauma-informed response. And this was something that was offered in the chat from one of our delegates about not having this one-size-fits-all approach and trying to pigeonhole everyone into a way of working because it's easier and it's less stressful from the organisation's point of view. It's also to see sort of leaping in there with judgments was also up there. And again, this is our biases, what we are comfortable with, what we think we know, or whether we've been in the role for a given time that we have seen a number of people coming up with the same issues and the same issues. And so we feel, yeah, we've seen one, we've seen them all. And so we just jump in there. And then that feeling service users can't be helped. That's interesting. You know, if they're coming to you, to come to the service for help, so there must be some way they can help, some way that you can get through to them. You know, it's not this hard to reach, not so easy to ignore. And then follow that up with hiring staff with particular practice background. Alongside that, particular groups will never access help. I thank you very much for giving us those views and answering that poll. It's been really helpful. So next I want to look at is who is more likely to be a policy and decision maker. And here I have provided a wheel of power, or privilege as I call it, which has been adopted from a Canadian model. So some of the language will not be UK centric. So I'll be taking some aspects from the wheel but putting it from the UK, using the UK language that we currently use. So if we were to look around this wheel and looking who gains the most power, who has the most power. If we look at the education on the sort of musty colour, we can see that on this model, it starts with elementary education, then high school, and then post-secondary. But from a UK point of view, we would look at this as being sort of, in the UK, it could also be independent schools are closer to the power. Those from independent schools, with high achieving state and grammar schools following close behind, and then low achieving state schools bringing up the rear. Equally, if we look at disability, again, the terms that are used are not really from a UK perspective. But if we use the terms of looking at those who are non-disabled are more closer to the power, followed by some with some disability, and then disabled or disadvantaged by society. And then also looking at mental health, looking at those who have no experience of mental health being close to the power. There are some that have some experience of mental health, and then those are chronic or ongoing mental health issues. So taking some of the other points on the wheel, who is more likely to be a policy and decision maker? Let's type in the chat and see from any other aspect of the wheel. Give your views about who you think would be likely to be the policy maker in some of those, under some of those headings. Be interested to hear your insight. So how does our unconscious bias, how can unconscious bias be expressed? One of the big ways that unconscious bias can be expressed is how it leaks out in our body language. The way we look, what we say, arms crossed, peering at somebody, can dictate how we respond and how we're going to interact with that person. And also our amygdala can get triggered into that flight method where we might not feel safe with the person that we're sitting with because of the difference. Or our daily language not being inclusive, particularly around, we've seen with the introduction of using non-binary, where people don't want to use lots of titles in their names and want to be referred in a certain way. It's about how we include those people rather than just lumping everybody together in one group. The way in which we don't ask questions for fear of making a mistake. But it's only through making mistakes that we'll be able to find out the answers. And then we've talked a lot about making assumptions, about doing things, saying things because we think that's right, or that's what we've always been told. And then this thing called microaggressions, which we're now going to come on to. So the definition of a microaggression is defined as a brief and commonplace verbal or behavioral outward display that communicates hostile, exclusionary, derogatory, or negative prejudicial slights and insults towards any group. It could be intentional or unintentional. However, the impact and how it is received by the recipient is key. You may have seen other words that describe a microaggression. Words such as micro assaults, micro incivilities, micro iniquities. But whichever term is used, these behaviours all create an atmosphere of exclusion and disrespect. And here are some examples of microaggressions. A woman being asked, when is she going to have a baby? People with visible disabilities being asked, what happened to them? Assumptions being made linking certain sexual orientations and promiscuity. And the infamous, where are you from? Where are you really from? And the amount of times that I've been asked that. And my answer is, I'm from Essex. And if I'm pushed, I'm from Romford in Essex. And I get the point and I get where they're coming from. But is that really necessary? Unless it's within context. And raising voices to those who are hard of hearing or anyone who has EAL. And another thing that's crept in, touching black hair without permission. Who does that? Why is that necessary? And does Asian skin go pale? Does black skin tan? Well, I can answer that one. Yes, it does tan. I do get my tan when I'm allowed to go on holiday. But those are just examples of some of the microaggressions, constant drip, drip expressions, words that are said, and often we don't realize we're doing it. But if we're corrected and we still continue to do it, then those are implicit. Those are things that we know that we shouldn't be doing. But it's really about what happens, the impact it has on the person on the receiving end. So I'd just like to reflect on some of the things that we've spoken about. So which service users may have had more access than others? What are the assumptions that are often made relating to referrals? Which type of identities have not been taken into account in your work, projects, events, and campaigns? How could you include them going forward? Thinking about what we've been talking about. How do you think you can, any of these questions have come up? Feel free to drop a line in the chat if anything comes to mind in your reflection. And then, as we know, all organisations will have policies and procedures that are there to help combat and support and inform on unconscious bias and inappropriate behaviours. We know that the Equality Act provides that umbrella approach for protected characteristic groups, but also your services will have various other policies and procedures which they are duty bound to follow, either from a legislative point of view or from an organisational point of view, where the organisation is committed to equality and diversity and inclusion. And all those are there to help and support staff or people against inappropriate behaviours. Yes, thank you for that, Kathy. Yes, one of the biggest barriers that Kathy's seeing is clients struggle with in recent COVID times is digital exclusion, IT access and capability. Yeah, this is something that's coming up. And also we've got rich and white. Thank you, Barbara. for your points there. But yeah, one of the barriers that we are seeing is the exclusion, and whether or not, we were talking earlier about this digital being used within COVID and whether it's being enhanced or not. And, the question that I raised earlier about social media and even having that access, is that helpful, or is that excluding people? The questions that's raised by Abby is, how do we challenge microaggression on a day-to-day basis? They can sometimes be more difficult to challenge when they're less obvious, or you only think of what you should have said after the fact. Yeah, it's about being supported to call out, Abby. I think that where we have mechanisms about addressing them, if we're in a meeting, if we hear inappropriate language being used in response to service users, it's about having that method to call things out. If that happens, about saying, when you said this is how I felt, or what was your thinking behind what you said, and just raising the issue, not in a defensive manner, but really just as a form of education, of highlighting that someone might not fully have understood a term or a phrase that's used, or just using a language for language sake, and then learning about the correct way just through polite asking in those questions in that way. And hopefully that's some way of trying to challenge the microaggressions. So what can we do to make it all work? We've got outreach and consultation. So it's about, when we go out to our service users, just be more aware, probably re-educate yourselves first before going out to consultation, so that you're aware of some of the issues that can arise and how different groups react in different ways. Where you might have a vision, mission, and values, breathing more life into it from an inclusive perspective, thinking about others, about your methods, about that you're going to be using. Including all relevant parties and services in case conferences, rather than just having a few people, but think more widely about some of the issues that can happen. Because where we have our individual service users, they come with many overlying and overlapping characteristics and challenges and barriers. And we just need to ensure that everybody is in the room that will be able to give voice to all those challenges and those barriers. And then there's having visible role models. If within your organization, service users can see that there are people like them, they probably feel more comfortable in coming forward and able to discuss any challenges they may be facing. And consider how everyone is supported to give their opinion should they want to, allowing that space to have that voice heard. And if it's within your own teams, think about that reflective practice, about having that safe space to raise issues. Ask the question, when you said this is how I felt, or why did you use that particular term? And try to make this part of all conversations that has had, so that you help to give people that space, that voice, to bring forward their concerns and their challenges. So what can we all do to make it work? Again, one good thing is reflect on your go-to assumptions. We all have those little boxes in our head that when we hear something or we're triggered by a particular instance, we go to that box and we take out whatever's in that box. But just stop yourselves and think, well, no, actually, that's not right. Or reflect on it, think about it. It's not about a good or bad binary. It's about having the ability to openly discuss and explore how and what can change. And as I was mentioning before, recognize the plurality of experiences within a given group. We all have different experiences, and all of these are overlaid by the various different groups we come from and our cultural background. Be an active bystander and call it out. As I said, there are methods to be used, not in defensive ways, but it's about unlearning to learn again. And create a questioning culture that illuminates blind spots. Where things might have been raised and left, enable those to be heard and to be addressed. Yes, where I've talked about staff being able to come out and challenge it, Amanda's raised a question about staff can feel worried about the impact on them if they challenge bias they see or experience. Is there a way to support staff to feel more confident to be able to speak up? And I think, yes, I think as an organisation, we can put things in place, give staff space, have groups where staff can feel safe to enable them to come and talk about these things. But it's about recognising that there is this issue around and that staff need to feel confident and safe that this will happen and that they will be supported. And we looked at previous policies and practices that most organisations will have, ensuring that those are there and that they're transparent and that they're able to be used by everyone. Yep, thank you. Yes, use your own experiences to challenge. Yeah, and sometimes, yes, it can be difficult to prove bias. But it's about trying to ensure and raise the aspect about the impact it has on that person. It's about recognizing changes in people as a result of this drip feed of, say, microaggressions, or where they've been feeling marginalized, or any groups of users that we might marginalize in the instance. Again, being open and honest and having powerful dialogues with people. Acknowledging mistakes and apologizing when things go wrong. The only way that we can unlearn to learn is by making mistakes. Oftentimes we have members of staff or even service users who have foreign names that we're not always able to understand or pronounce, but ask the question, have I pronounced your name correctly? Don't substitute the name for an anglicized name in some instances. When I was working in the education system, there was a program where they had lots of international students coming on. And one way they combated enabling everyone to feel part of the group was that they asked them to insert their name into their email signature. And when you clicked on it, it pronounced that name phonetically. So you didn't have an excuse not to approach that person by their name. Or if you did, at least you'd have the beginnings of being able to pronounce that. And then you set up a dialogue between the two of you to find out, have I made a mistake here? And then you can apologize if that's the case and you've been corrected. And there's regular consultations and feedback with your team, staff and partners, including reflective practices as we spoke about earlier. Being driven by an organization's vision. If that vision is one of openness and transparency, and it will also have support, then that is what will drive giving staff and service users the ability to feel that they can come and open up and use the services. And ask the question, what have we done to improve and enhance all lives? Again, this could be a question that could be asked at team meetings, or just reflecting on yourselves. What have you done to improve and enhance the lives of service users who you've come into contact with? Was there anything that you could have done differently? You know, is it something that you've done that has worked that you could share with your colleagues? Ask that question. Okay, so now we've got quite a bit of time for some question and answers. Let's see what we've got in our Q&A. Right, so great. Jason has asked, what can you do to combat unconscious implicit bias being directed towards yourself when providing a service? It's interesting, Jason, that's very difficult. Because if you're providing a service, you shouldn't be receiving unconscious or implicit bias. But it's about funneling that and showing and trying to correct the behavior of the person who is directing it towards you. And you understanding that could be as a result of other issues that are happening with the service user, and not to take that too much to heart. In the next question from Amanda, if an organisation wants to review how they are working to identify where unconscious bias is affecting staff and people accessing their services, what can they do to start this process? Are there any good examples of best practice where other services have addressed and changed this within the homelessness sector? I'm not sure if any other services within the homelessness sector that's done this, Amanda, but where I've seen the training that's been given, training such as this, which opens up to looking at what the sort of behaviour patterns are within the organisation that are affecting this unconscious bias. Looking at even having in your conferences that you have around service users, and also looking at within staff itself, sort of behaviours that are exhibited and the ways in which that can affect people, and bringing that to the fore and having those discussions in an open forum so that staff can be made more aware of. And, you know, where possible, and there's support given to call these things out, because unless we can call them out, they will continue because the person won't know, you know, and it's always good to have that person know. So it's about just, as I said, having that conversation, not in a defensive way, but having that conversation that is inquiring, asking why you said or did what you did. We've got a question from Ektarana. In my line of work, I assess applications on behalf of applicants I never see in person. Are there ways unconscious bias can sneak into written applications, and what can we do to ensure our processes and written communication is fair and impartial? Yeah, I think there are ways that unconscious bias can sneak into written applications, particularly some ways, in ways that some applicants may write. Some may write using well-known words from the dictionary. Others may use other words that are probably slang, and that sometimes triggers our unconscious bias. Things like grammar, for instance, is one way that triggers unconscious bias. And it's about having that conversation beforehand, that if you have specific questions that are asked, and if the person's answered that question, irrespective of the way the grammar has been put on the paper, then that should be, that's what you are looking for. You shouldn't let the state of the grammar or the missing apostrophe here or there detract from what you're trying to achieve in trying to give that person a chance. And again, it's looking at your processes to ensure that where you are, that you're asking questions that are open, that allows everyone to talk about what they need to talk about in the application, and that you're not hindering anybody from putting what they want to put in order to support their application. I hope that's helped you there going forward. Anybody else? Right, thank you very much for including those. Thank you, Amanda. So you have there's a training fund that frontline workers can apply to. If you're registered with the network, you can apply for up to £500 for individual and £1,000 for group training. Off the back of this training, if you would like to explore this area further, yeah, have a word with Amanda. There's a link there. And if you're a frontline worker, support people experiencing homelessness, you can register here. So thanks very much for putting that in the chat. Some good information there about next steps. Good question, Amanda. Should employers remove certain data from job applications to support reducing unconscious bias when they are shortlisting? We've seen that in many instances, lots of organisations are using what they call blind interviewing, blind applications, in which they're removing any personal information that can help to trigger unconscious bias. Because as we've seen, that unconscious bias can be triggered by the fact of someone speaking, of somebody writing, of somebody visually. So if we can remove, or even where they live, the area they live in, the school that they went to, all those things can trigger our unconscious bias, our preferences within us. And so many employers are starting to do blind shortlisting. They're also doing video recruitment to help stop people who might not be able to give proper written applications, but can do it verbally and are happy to do so. So I think in a lot of instances that are happening, it depends on the strength of the activity that's been taken. Sometimes it does show a marked response in having underrepresented groups making applications for the roles. But I think it helps people to press that pause button and really consider the application for what it is, rather than defaulting to the easy option in considering applications, and not using certain aspects to detract and stop them considering someone fairly and openly. Right, I hope I've answered your questions. Are there any other questions that people would like to ask?
I've got a quick question, if that's all right, Sandra.
Yeah.
It's stuff around sort of like co-production, and when services have people with sort of lived experience who sort of come on board either as volunteers or members of staff. And like, is there risk, and if there is, how do you manage it, of like unconscious bias there, because you're possibly working with people where you know their history, you know a lot about them because they might have used your service or similar services, and sort of how do you maybe combat that sort of unconscious bias when you're maybe doing that sort of kind of that co-production work?
Yeah, good question, Joe. I think it's looking at what are you looking for in that in the role that you're applying for, or having those persons, because that should not be the reasons as to why, even though you have that knowledge of those people, that shouldn't be what makes you, that shouldn't be coming to the fore. If you have proper procedures in place, and you have proper specifications for the roles, then those are the only things that you should be considering. you hopefully within the organisation you'll have training that people can go on to help them manage and provide with strategies to help cope with some of the behaviours that you might be aware of. And that's where I think I would be directing, making use of what the organisation has to ensure that these behaviours are sort of kept in check and that these people are made aware of some of the behaviours that they might not be aware of or have.
Thank you.
Thank you. Right, if there are no further questions, I just want to think about when you leave here today, just think about one small action that you can do in your action planning. Because we've heard a lot of information today, we've shared some really good thoughts in some of the questions that we received. So what actions will you be taking following this session? What actions will you be taking to check your own biases? What action would you be taking to find out whether or not your organisation addresses these issues or have a place to do this? And we've seen that Amanda's kindly put some links in the chat for us to follow. So just to recap on some of the things that we've done today. So we've defined what we mean by unconscious bias. We've had a look at the psychology behind our thinking, our behaviours, stereotypes and attitudes, thinking about systems 1 and system 2 thinking, about the aim to pause and stop and think, rather than just going to our default buttons around things that we think we know, or customs and practices that we've been growing up with. We've discussed how we can recognise and address unconscious bias in ourselves, in colleagues and organisations. And I hope that some of the examples that were provided and some of the examples that we've had in the questions have helped to give you some thoughts and some areas to think about around those areas. And explored how staff and organisations can overcome this and adapt. And we've seen, about the use of reflective practices, how that can be really utilised to great effect. And we've also covered some of the strategies to managing unconscious bias and taking action going forward. Having active bystanding, helping to give staff the space and confidence to call things out and to address and discuss things in an open and safe forum. And that's me. Thank you very much for participating. That's my name and my details from Diverse Minds. Thank you very much. And thank you, Amanda, for inviting us to this session.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sandra. To everyone who's on the call, sort of thank you for participating, and as sort of been said in the chat, we'll make sure that this recording is up on our website in the next couple of days, and we'll also put a link into Diverse Minds as well. So if anyone has any further questions or wants to sort of explore this area a little bit more, we'll make sure that that link's there as well, so it's very easy for everyone to find as well.
Thank you very much for that, Joe.
Brilliant.
Thank you all for participating.
Yeah, thank you all. So, because there's no more questions and stuff, I'm going to stop this now. And then for delegates and stuff, we've got a panel discussion coming up at 3:40, which is really interesting. And we have speakers from across the 4 nations of the UK. So it would be worth tuning in for that to see what is happening in different parts of the country. So thank you very much, and hopefully we will see you later on at 3:40.